I remember the moment like it was yesterday. The sunlight glinting off the glass walls of the Reynolds and Company boardroom. The faint hum of the city below. And that look on Ethan's face, calm, rehearsed, like he was reading lines from a script he'd perfected over decades. Jasmine, your services are no longer required. 5 words. 5 words that hit harder than a hammer on thick glass. And for a second, just a second, I froze. I'm Jasmine Brown. I'm black. I'm proud. And I've clawed my way up from the projects in Brooklyn to this corner office. This corner of power in a world designed to underestimate me at every turn. I've navigated microaggressions, coded my life into spreadsheets, and turned overlooked talent into billion-dollar deals. And yet here I was, being told that my presence was dispensable. Denise, from our, opened first, voice calm, almost too calm. We've received concerns regarding your conduct and teamwork. Leadership believes your position may no longer be a good fit. I let the silence stretch. Not because I was speechless. No, this was my moment to weigh every word, every expression. I let the faint tapping of the rain on the floor to ceiling windows set the rhythm. I leaned forward, fingers brushing the polished mahogany table. A good fit? I repeated, slow, deliberate. Let me remind you. I've spent 20 years building this company. Navigating politics that would swallow most alive. Mentoring colleagues, many of whom are here today. And now, suddenly, I'm no longer a good fit? The words hung. Denise blinked. I could see it. Her understanding of unspoken truths we shared. The streets we grew up on didn't teach us to fold. They taught us to hustle. To survive. To fight smarter than the system ever expected. Ethan didn't flinch, but I caught the slightest tremor in his posture. A crack. My first victory. Silent but undeniable. You see, I continued, I've endured discrimination. Countless underestimations. Subtle and not so subtle slights. I've delivered results when others said it was impossible. And if anyone thinks that means I'll quietly step aside, they're mistaken. I let my words sink in, letting the weight of my history, my community, my ancestors' struggles, press upon the room. This wasn't just about me. This was about every black professional who had been overlooked, pushed aside, or silenced. Every person who had to work twice as hard for recognition in a world that designs success as a system of exclusion. I thought of my mentors in Harlem and Queens. The neighborhood barbershop debates about fairness. The late-night talks with my mother about dignity and poise. Every lesson sharpened my mind and honed my patience. I wasn't just fighting for my job. I was fighting for respect. For justice. For the principle that brilliance cannot be erased because of race or discomfort with power. I sat back, calm, letting my aura fill the room. I'm not here to negotiate my exit quietly. I'm here to ensure that fairness is served. Respect isn't granted, it's earned. And I intend to earn it, loudly. If I must. There it was. The first flicker of doubt in their eyes. Not fear of me personally. But the realization that I am a strategist. A tactician. A woman who knows every loophole. Every ally. Every weak point in this corporate maze. I was underestimated. Always underestimated. And that was their first mistake. That evening, walking back to my apartment in Harlem, I let myself breathe, but my mind raced. Every meeting, every conversation, every casual remark in the halls, they had given me material. I started to map the network. Who owed favors? Who feared exposure? Who had hidden agendas? I traced every opportunity to turn their arrogance against them. By the time I reached my building, I had a plan forming, not one born of anger, but of strategy. Each move calculated, each step deliberate. This wasn't a whim. This was justice in motion. I also thought about my community. The young black professionals watching, learning, struggling in their first corporate jobs. I owed them an example. Not a story of retreat. Not a story of submission. But a story of empowerment, resilience, and smart, unapologetic ambition. Over the next weeks, I collected information, nurtured alliances, and studied the vulnerabilities of the system that had tried to discard me. I refined my appearance, sharpened my words, and rehearsed my demeanor. Every detail of Jasmine Brown's presence would command attention. Because I knew one truth that nobody else in that room seemed to understand. A woman like me doesn't wait for justice, she creates it. And as I stared out over the city from my modest apartment, sipping on black coffee, I allowed a small, confident smile. This wasn't the end. This was the beginning. Every slight, every injustice, every glance that tried to diminish me had led to this. My story, our story, was about to be rewritten. The game had changed, and I was ready. The city lights reflected off the rain-slicked streets as I left my apartment building. Determination thrumming through my veins. I wasn't just going to survive this. I was going to turn it into my arena. Every slight, every whispered criticism, every suggestion that I step aside was fuel. And black women, we know how to turn fuel into fire. I started small, observing, watching. Every detail mattered. Who laughed at whose jokes in meetings? Who always skipped the acknowledgement emails? Which senior executives quietly feared confrontation and which thrived on it? I needed the blueprint of their arrogance. And I would have it. I met with Malik, one of my closest allies in finance. Malik was a brilliant mind with street smarts that matched his corporate acuity. We'd grown up in the same neighborhood, both of us knowing early on that doors rarely open without a strategic push. Jasmine, they're playing dirty, he said, leaning back in his chair. You can't just react, you have to control the narrative. Exactly, controlling the narrative. That became my mantra. Over the next few days, I meticulously documented every interaction, every decision that undermined me. Emails, memos, even casual hallway comments. I built a timeline of injustice, not just for myself, but to show the patterns of systemic negligence within the company. This was about more than revenge, it was about exposing truth. I also started reconnecting with my community network, former interns, young black colleagues struggling in the same corporate halls I once navigated. They became my sounding board, my advisory circle. Empowerment isn't solo, it's collective. I shared with them what I'd learned, listening to their stories, validating their frustrations, and letting them know that visibility and voice are tools as sharp as any spreadsheet or balance sheet. One evening, as I pored over documents in my apartment, Malik called. Jasmine, the board is underestimating you. They think this is a quiet resignation. But you're planning a masterstroke. I smiled. It's never quiet when I'm involved. They're going to feel the subtle pressure of someone who knows every corner of the game. That weekend, I rehearsed, not speeches, not threats, but presence. How I walked into a room. How I paused before speaking. How I could let a question linger just long enough to expose doubt. Every nuance mattered. In corporate culture, subtlety is power. Misused, it's destruction. At work, the energy shifted. Ethan and Denise were cautiously polite. Aware of my quiet calculation, I started nudging initiatives that would spotlight my expertise. Every proposal I submitted had undeniable metrics, tangible outcomes, and just enough ambiguity to require their oversight. They couldn't dismiss me without revealing their own incompetence or bias. The first test came unexpectedly. A high-stakes client presentation. The kind that could make or break reputations. I knew they were counting on me to fail, expecting missteps, hoping to use it as justification for my removal. But preparation was my secret weapon. I stayed late, rehearsed with Malik and my team, anticipated every question, every challenge. The day of the presentation, I walked into the boardroom. Calm, controlled, radiating competence. The client asked a series of complex questions, each designed to test confidence. I answered clearly, concisely, weaving in industry insights and strategic recommendations. Ethan watched, expression neutral, but I could see the subtle tension in his jaw. Denise scribbled notes furiously, too focused to maintain her usual cold detachment. By the end, the client was impressed. This is exactly the guidance we need, they said. Jasmine, your leadership is evident in every proposal you've presented. The room acknowledged me, not with applause, but with respect, the power of undeniable performance. Back at my desk, I allowed myself a moment of quiet victory. But celebration was short-lived. Strategy never rests. I drafted my next moves, carefully balancing influence, alliances, and exposure. I identified key vulnerabilities in Ethan's and Denise's influence, pinpointed areas where their decisions could be challenged legally or ethically. Corporate chess requires patience, foresight, and courage. And yet, it wasn't just about strategy, it was personal empowerment. Walking past my office window that evening, I caught my reflection. The woman staring back was not the girl who doubted herself in the early years at Reynolds & Co. She was someone who claimed space unapologetically, who understood that justice isn't given, it's earned. Every small victory fed into the larger plan to reclaim respect, authority, and dignity. Over the following weeks, my plan gained momentum. Quiet conversations, strategic mentoring sessions, selective exposure of weaknesses in the hierarchy. I was careful, deliberate, never overt. In the corporate world, subtlety is lethal, aggression is obvious. I also leaned on the culture that had shaped me. Saturday mornings spent at the community center. Sunday church gatherings, spaces where stories, encouragement, and resilience intertwined. The wisdom of elders, the optimism of youth, the shared knowledge of struggle. These became my guides, my moral compass. They reminded me that power without integrity is hollow. But clever strategy fused with authenticity is unstoppable. One late night, Malik sent a message. "You're ready. Every piece is in place. Now it's just about execution." I closed my laptop, breathing in the night air from my balcony, feeling the pulse of Harlem beneath me. This wasn't just about me anymore, it was about showing the system that exclusion, bias, and dismissal could be met with precision, intelligence, and resilience. I allowed myself a smirk. Ethan and Denise might have underestimated me, but Jasmine Brown never underestimates herself. The boardroom, the city, the community, they were all part of the same arena. And in this game, I would win not just for myself, but for everyone who had been overlooked, underestimated, and undervalued. The pieces were set, the plan was clear, and soon, the storm would break, and it would be mine to command. Monday morning arrived with the kind of oppressive humidity that made the city feel heavier than usual. But inside me, a storm had already formed. I walked into the office with a calmness that belied the fire simmering beneath the surface. Every step, every glance, every handshake was deliberate, a declaration that I was no longer a passive player. Ethan and Denise greeted me with that thin veneer of civility, the kind that never reaches the eyes. They thought I was still reacting, still uncertain. They were wrong. I had spent nights meticulously planning, aligning allies, and creating contingencies for every move they could make. My network inside the company, young associates who often felt voiceless, were ready to support me. Subtlety was my weapon, unity was my shield. The first phase of my plan involved reclaiming visibility. I volunteered for a high-profile project no one else wanted, a client expansion initiative with complex logistics and intense scrutiny. Everyone expected me to struggle, to falter under pressure. That's exactly what I wanted. They underestimated the power of preparation, intellect, and relentless focus. I scheduled a series of meetings with stakeholders, ensuring that my approach highlighted both innovation and practical solutions. Malik advised, "Don't just present solutions. Make them feel that following your lead is the only logical choice." And he was right. I wasn't just leading a project. I was subtly demonstrating authority and control, without overtly challenging anyone. That would come later. Cultural awareness played a subtle, yet critical role. I drew inspiration from my community, Sunday morning church sermons, family discussions about integrity, resilience, and survival. I infused these lessons into the way I communicated, ensuring my presence carried confidence, empathy, and authenticity. Colleagues responded instinctively to that energy, often before they realized why. It was a gentle reminder: Black excellence in action cannot be ignored. Meanwhile, I began to quietly expose cracks in Ethan's and Denise's oversight. Not maliciously, not with confrontation, but strategically. I sent carefully worded updates, highlighting project risks they had overlooked. I asked probing questions during meetings, encouraging transparency in decision-making, all while keeping my tone respectful. Each move subtly shifted the perception of competence. I was building a narrative that positioned me as indispensable, while revealing their misjudgments. One afternoon, I overheard a conversation between Ethan and Denise. They were discussing a budget reallocation, an opportunity they thought they could use to undermine me. Instead, I leveraged it. I submitted a thorough proposal that demonstrated not only fiscal responsibility but forward-thinking strategy. The board approved it unanimously. I felt a quiet thrill. The chessboard was tilting in my favor. Outside the office, I maintained the community ties that grounded me. Coffee meetups with interns, mentoring sessions with junior colleagues, casual walks with old friends. Each interaction reinforced my sense of purpose and commitment. I wasn't acting in isolation. I was embodying the principle that collective strength empowers individual action. My revenge wasn't just personal. It was emblematic of what happens when underestimated voices assert themselves with intelligence and grace. One evening, as I reviewed the week's progress, Malik texted, "Phase 1 complete. They're reacting, not leading. Next, we push for influence in key decisions." I nodded to myself, imagining the steps to come. I would need to orchestrate opportunities where Ethan's mistakes became visible, where Denise's biases could no longer hide behind procedural opacity. Precision, timing, and psychological insight were everything. The tension was mounting. Each day, I felt the subtle shifts, whispers in the hallways, hesitant glances during meetings, cautious acknowledgement of my input. The air was thick with anticipation, a silent acknowledgement that Jasmine Brown was not to be ignored. I allowed myself a small, private smile. They believed they controlled the narrative, but the narrative was mine now to shape. I also prepared for the emotional toll. Revenge, even strategic, requires fortitude. I reminded myself that empowerment is not vengeance alone. It's the art of reclaiming dignity, asserting presence, and transforming injustice into opportunity. Every carefully placed email, every tactful question, every controlled pause was a statement. I exist. I matter. I will not be sidelined. By the end of the week, the groundwork was set. Ethan and Denise were flustered, unsure of the boundaries I had silently redrawn. The young associates I'd guided were emboldened, ready to follow, to observe, to document. The company was a stage, and I was directing an intricate, unseen performance. Justice, subtle yet inevitable, was on its way. As I left the office on Friday evening, the sunset painted the skyline in streaks of orange and purple. The city thrummed with life beneath me, unaware of the quiet revolution unfolding within the glass walls of Reynolds & Co. I allowed myself a moment to reflect. The path of corporate revenge is not merely tactical, it is profoundly personal. Infused with integrity, strategy, and the unyielding pursuit of recognition and respect. And in that reflection, I knew one thing with certainty. The storm I had begun to conjure would not just pass, it would redefine the power dynamics that had once tried to suppress me. The next act was coming, and it would be nothing short of decisive. Monday felt different. The office buzzed with the usual chaos, but I could sense an undercurrent of anticipation. Every glance at my desk, every whisper that trailed me in the hallway, spoke volumes. They knew something had shifted. I had spent the weekend rehearsing, refining, and aligning my strategy. The boardroom was no longer just a room, it was a battlefield. And I was ready to claim it. Denise called the weekly meeting. Her tone sharp, rehearsed, like she was trying to maintain control. Ethan followed behind her, smug as ever, unaware of the storm quietly brewing. I walked in, calm, collected, my posture radiating authority. I wasn't just entering a meeting, I was asserting presence, reclaiming the space that had been undermined for too long. The project I had been leading, the one everyone had doubted, was now my lever. I began by presenting results with clarity and precision, highlighting every milestone achieved, every challenge overcome, and every risk mitigated. The language was crisp, assertive, unflinching, leaving no room for doubt. Board members who had previously dismissed me were now leaning forward, nodding, taking notes. I could feel the subtle shifts in power. My credibility was undeniable. Ethan interjected, attempting to downplay my achievements. I didn't flinch. Instead, I asked pointed questions, guiding the conversation toward facts he couldn't deny. Every hesitation, every vague answer, subtly exposed gaps in his oversight. I noticed Denise's eyes flicker, uncertainty creeping into her practiced calm. I wasn't attacking openly. I was revealing the truth in plain sight. I drew strength from the community I represented. I thought of Sunday services where elders spoke of resilience, perseverance, and standing tall in the face of injustice. I channeled that energy into every word, every pause, every subtle nod. My presence was more than authority. It was a statement, black excellence. When combined with intellect and strategy, commands attention. The young associates I had quietly mentored were now my eyes and ears. They contributed insights during the discussion, asking questions that highlighted overlooked details. I subtly directed their involvement, ensuring they appeared confident and informed, without seeming orchestrated. This was empowerment in action, lifting others while consolidating influence. As the meeting progressed, I laid out a proposal that addressed a long-standing issue in the company's logistics process, a problem Ethan had consistently ignored. I presented a solution that was innovative, cost-effective, and practically bulletproof. The board reacted immediately, asking for clarifications, validating numbers, and seeking further input. The spotlight shifted entirely. Denise tried to regain control, redirecting the conversation, but it was too late. The narrative had changed. The board saw who was leading, who had vision, who could deliver results under pressure. I could almost hear the unspoken acknowledgement. Jasmine Brown was not merely competent, she was indispensable. Outside the formal presentations, I deployed subtle reminders of accountability. I followed up with detailed emails, copied relevant stakeholders, highlighting successes and noting challenges that had previously been ignored. Each communication was measured, professional, yet strategically revealing. By the end of the day, whispers had turned into conversations, and conversations into recognition. The power balance was shifting, quietly, inexorably. The personal satisfaction was immense. But I reminded myself to stay disciplined. Revenge in corporate environments is not about impulsive confrontation, it is about precision, patience, and calculated influence. I allowed myself brief moments to smile privately, knowing that each strategic move was pushing the narrative toward inevitable justice. As I left the office that evening, the skyline ablaze with city lights, I felt a sense of triumph tempered by anticipation. The boardroom battle was only one step. Ethan and Denise were unsettled, unsure of how to respond, while I had not yet unveiled the full extent of my plan. The story was mine to write, and the climax was drawing near. In those quiet moments, I reflected on the journey, on the blend of intellect, culture, community, and empowerment that had brought me to this point. I realized that true revenge is not just about winning. It's about asserting presence, reclaiming dignity, uplifting others, and transforming injustice into opportunity. And that, I thought, is a lesson the board, and everyone who ever doubted me, would remember. The morning felt electric, charged with a tension that only comes before the storm. I walked into the office with purpose, my heels clicking against the polished floors like a metronome counting down to the moment of truth. Today wasn't about proving competence. It wasn't about presenting data or negotiating resources. Today was about reclaiming what was mine and exposing the truth. I arrived at the boardroom early, setting the stage, subtle adjustments, a strategically placed folder here, a brief note for key allies there, everything meticulously planned. The people I had mentored, the interns, junior associates, even a few overlooked analysts, were all briefed to observe, to participate, to witness. Empowerment had always been part of my strategy, lifting others while securing my position. And today, it would be undeniable. Denise entered first, a practiced smile masking uncertainty. Ethan followed, confident, smug, unaware that the narrative had shifted. He had always underestimated the quiet strength of a black woman in corporate America, a mistake he would pay for. I remained seated until the last second, letting their impatience hang in the air like a thin, taut wire. Then I rose, calm, radiant, every inch the executive they had tried to dismiss. The meeting began with my presentation. But this time, it was more than numbers. I wove stories of struggle, resilience, and triumph, grounding the corporate facts in the reality of lives impacted, communities supported. Diversity initiatives championed. Overlooked teams elevated. I watched their faces shift from indifference to curiosity to unease. I wasn't just making a point. I was telling a truth they couldn't ignore. Ethan tried to interrupt, to redirect, to minimize. I allowed a brief pause, letting the silence land heavily. Then I spoke. Precise, measured, cutting through the tension. Ethan, you've overseen this department for years. But the gaps here are undeniable. The inefficiencies, the missed opportunities, they're not mistakes. They're patterns. Patterns that cost this company millions and diminish the work of those who dedicate themselves tirelessly. Eyes turned. Murmurs rippled. Denise's hands tightened around her pen. The board felt it. The momentum had shifted. I didn't shout. I didn't dramatize. I revealed. Step by step. I highlighted failures, contrasting them with my team's ingenuity, dedication, and results. By the end, the room was no longer a courtroom, it was a stage. And I held every act of the drama. Then came the coup de grace. A simple slide, a projection of internal emails, performance reports, and overlooked approvals. Facts Ethan had tried to bury. I guided the board through each one, drawing attention to every misstep, every oversight. By the time I finished, the air was thick with inevitability. The board knew who had been the true leader all along. Outside the boardroom, whispers turned to conversations. Employees I had quietly championed now nodded in acknowledgement. Mentors, colleagues, even the administrative staff offered discreet smiles of respect. In this office, in this community, I had proven that intelligence, perseverance, and strategic cunning could dismantle injustice. Justice wasn't loud, it was precise. By mid-afternoon, Denise and Ethan were cornered, not humiliated by drama, but exposed by truth and undeniable performance. They realized the board's confidence was no longer theirs to command. My plan, carefully executed, had shifted the balance completely. The feeling was empowering, yes, but it was also sobering. Corporate revenge is never about malice, it's about setting things right, reclaiming space, and lifting those who have been overlooked. As I left the building that evening, city lights flickering like stars reflected in the glass, I reflected on the journey. Every slight, every microaggression, every moment of dismissal had led to this. I had turned injustice into opportunity, doubt into recognition, silence into voice, and the lesson was clear. When you combine intellect, strategy, and the courage to stand firm, you don't just survive, you thrive. And you empower others to do the same. Tonight, I would go home, recharge, and plan the next phase, not just for me, but for every Black professional who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed. Today, Jasmine Brown didn't just win a boardroom battle. Today, she redefined what power and justice look like in the corporate world. The air in the boardroom was thick enough to cut. I could feel it pressing against my skin as I walked in. Poised, carrying the weight of every slight, every underestimated contribution, every subtle dismissal I'd endured as a Black woman climbing the corporate ladder. Today wasn't just about a meeting. It was about justice, visibility, and empowerment, for me, for my team, for every overlooked voice in this office. Denise was already seated, her posture perfect, but her eyes betrayed tension. Malik hovered near the window, arms crossed, radiating that familiar arrogance that had always grated under my skin. They believed confidence alone could shield them from scrutiny. They believed the narrative was theirs to control. I was about to prove them wrong. I took my seat at the head of the table. A small, deliberate act, a symbolic reclaiming of authority. As I opened my laptop, I could feel the board's attention shifting, the murmur of whispers fading into anticipatory silence. This wasn't going to be a presentation. It was a showdown. Good morning, I began, my voice steady but layered with intensity. I appreciate you all being here. Today, we review not just numbers and performance metrics, but decisions, accountability, and leadership. Malik's lips twitched as if to interrupt, but I held up a hand. A silent assertion of control. Empowerment isn't loud, it's strategic. I laid out the evidence, emails, meeting notes, project reports, and performance evaluations, each document meticulously selected to illustrate the truth. Missed deadlines, overlooked opportunities, And, most critically, the systemic bias that had quietly eroded recognition for my contributions. But I didn't stop there. I highlighted how my leadership had corrected these gaps, turning potential disasters into wins. The board's reactions were subtle but unmistakable. Furrowed brows, exchanged glances, shifting in their seats. Denise's pen hovered over her notes, her hand trembling slightly. Malik's jaw clenched. He knew this wasn't just a critique, this was a revelation. Let's talk about fairness, I continued, locking eyes with each member. For too long, the voices of those from underrepresented backgrounds have been minimized. Decisions made behind closed doors have cost this company talent, efficiency, and integrity. I won't stand silent while history repeats itself. I could see the micro-expressions, the subtle shifts that betray unease. This was the beauty of precision in corporate strategy. Truth delivered with calm authority hits harder than theatrics. Then came the tactical reveal, a comprehensive report mapping each team's performance. Credit where it was due, and the tangible results of my leadership. Every overlooked initiative I had championed, every mentorship I had provided, every crisis I had averted, laid bare. It was undeniable. I wasn't asking for recognition, I was showing it. Malik tried again, voice rising slightly, but it lacked the weight it once held. I let a beat pass, allowing the silence to amplify his impotence. Denise attempted to interject, a hint of defensive energy. But the board's attention had shifted. They were listening to results, evidence, and strategy, not excuses. The numbers don't lie, I said softly, yet firmly. Leadership isn't about seniority, connections, or visibility. It's about impact, foresight, and the ability to empower your team. My record is clear. The final blow was simple but effective, a direct proposal for organizational restructuring, giving my team the roles, recognition, and authority they deserved. It wasn't revenge in the petty sense, it was justice framed through competence and transparency. By the end of the meeting, the boardroom felt transformed. Malik slouched slightly, his aura of invincibility eroded. Denise's controlled composure cracked just enough for me to see acknowledgement, perhaps even respect. The narrative had shifted, irrevocably. The room was no longer a fortress of old power dynamics. It was an arena where fairness and strategy had triumphed. Walking out, I could feel the energy shift in the office. Colleagues who had been silent, cautious, or hesitant now met my gaze with a subtle nod, a shared recognition of resilience and skill. Empowerment had a ripple effect. It wasn't just mine, it belonged to everyone I had fought alongside. Everyone who had endured inequity quietly but refused to be invisible. That night, as city lights glimmered against the glass walls, I reflected on what had just occurred. Corporate revenge isn't about malice or spectacle, it's about asserting value, reclaiming respect, and using your intellect and strategy to correct injustice. I had turned frustration into action, slights into strategy, and doubt into undeniable proof of competence. And in that moment, I understood something fundamental. Power isn't given, it's earned, demonstrated, and, when necessary, reclaimed. The boardroom had witnessed it. The company had witnessed it. And I had lived it. The following weeks were a storm, quiet yet relentless. I watched as the boardroom, the once familiar battleground, began to shift in subtle, unmistakable ways. Malik's presence had lost its weight, the casual arrogance replaced with caution. Denise's meticulously controlled composure cracked under the subtle pressure of accountability. And me? I moved through the office with a calm determination. Like a river cutting through stone, steady, unyielding, and quietly transformative. Every step I took now carried a purpose. My actions had ignited conversations behind closed doors, about equity, recognition, and the silent power of resilience. Colleagues who once hesitated to voice their ideas now approached me with tentative confidence. I realized, perhaps for the first time, the depth of influence a single determined voice could wield. I spent time mentoring my team, not just in strategy or technical skills, but in navigating corporate politics with integrity, resilience, and strategic empathy. I shared the nuances I had learned, how to assert presence without arrogance, how to use observation as leverage, How to transform frustration into actionable strategy. Empowerment, I discovered, is not given, it is cultivated and shared. At the same time, I couldn't ignore the cultural undertones of our workplace. Being a black woman in executive leadership was not just a role, it was a statement of representation. A subtle rebellion against centuries of invisible ceilings. Every meeting I led, every decision I made, echoed beyond our office walls, into the community. Into networks that had long waited for figures like me to claim visible, undeniable authority. One afternoon, Malik tried to reclaim control. He scheduled a meeting with the intention to undermine my authority, to assert dominance with charm and assumed influence. I knew it would come. I had anticipated it, and I welcomed it. The room was tense when I entered. Malik already seated with that familiar, overconfident grin, but this time, I was prepared in every sense. I had notes, reports, and evidence ready, not just about performance metrics, but about leadership impact, mentorship outcomes, and community engagement initiatives I had spearheaded. Malik, I said, voice measured, confident, I appreciate you taking the time to meet. I understand there have been concerns about team direction and project outcomes. Let's review the facts and work toward clarity. He tried to interject, charm in full force, but I guided the discussion with precision. Every statistic, every anecdote, every decision he had misrepresented or minimized, I countered, not with aggression, but with clarity and authority. The subtle power of evidence and preparation made my rebuttals sharp and undeniable. By the end of the hour, the dynamic had shifted entirely. Malik's confidence faltered. Denise watched silently, perhaps learning a lesson in humility and respect. My team, observing from outside the glass walls, saw not just their leader in action, but a blueprint for resilience, strategy, and empowerment. But corporate revenge isn't about humiliating others. It's about transforming adversity into strategic advantage and growth. I made a conscious choice not to exploit personal vulnerabilities, not to humiliate colleagues publicly. My revenge was in the undeniable demonstration of competence, integrity, and leadership, a mirror held up to those who doubted, revealing both truth and consequence. In the following months, I continued to champion equity within our office. Initiatives that had been overlooked were finally implemented. Projects that had stalled found direction. Mentorship programs were formalized to ensure that no voice would go unheard. The culture of subtle exclusion began to erode, replaced by a cautious but genuine respect for diverse talent and perspective. I found myself reflecting often on the interconnectedness of community and professional life. Our office, much like our broader neighborhoods, thrives on recognition, inclusion, and empowerment. Success is never solely individual. It is a network of shared victories, mentorship, and mutual respect. My personal journey had become a vessel for change beyond my immediate sphere, influencing corporate norms and inspiring colleagues to recognize their own potential. Yet, there was a personal transformation I hadn't anticipated. I realized that revenge, in its truest form, was never about others. It was about reclaiming my own narrative. For too long, I had allowed microaggressions, biases, and office politics to dictate the perception of my value. By strategically reclaiming authority and demonstrating resilience, I had rewritten my story, not for recognition, but for self-respect, empowerment, and authentic leadership. Walking out of the office late one evening, the city skyline shimmering through the glass walls, I felt a quiet satisfaction. Not triumphalism, not vengeance in the petty sense, but clarity, power, and a profound sense of justice. The world had seen me, my team had seen me, and I had seen myself, capable, strategic, resilient, and unapologetically empowered. From that moment on, every decision I made was guided by strategic empathy, integrity, and empowerment. I led with confidence, mentored with intent, and advocated with precision. I understood that true corporate revenge is the art of elevating yourself and your team through adversity, not tearing others down. And perhaps most importantly, I realized that resilience and empowerment create a ripple effect. Colleagues inspired by my journey began their own advocacy, mentorship, and leadership. Small victories compounded into cultural shifts. What had begun as a personal struggle against injustice had grown into a broader movement of awareness, equity, and empowerment, proof that one voice, skillfully wielded, can echo far beyond the walls it first occupied. By the end of the year, the company had changed, subtly but irrevocably. Policies reflected equity, recognition systems were fairer, and the corporate culture embraced the value of authentic leadership. Malik had adapted, learning that charisma alone does not secure influence. Denise had shifted, understanding that control must be tempered with accountability. And I had grown, becoming not just a leader but a symbol of resilience, strategic intelligence, and empowerment for the Black community and for anyone who had ever felt invisible in spaces of power. Jasmine Brown had won, but not through malice, deceit, or spectacle. I had won through vision, strategy, integrity, and an unwavering commitment to justice. And as I looked out over the city one last time that December evening, I whispered to myself, power is earned, justice is claimed, and resilience echoes. The following weeks were a storm, quiet yet relentless. I watched as the boardroom, the once familiar battleground, began to shift in subtle, unmistakable ways. Malik's presence had lost its weight, the casual arrogance replaced with caution. Denise's meticulously controlled composure cracked under the subtle pressure of accountability. In me, I moved through the office with a calm determination, like a river cutting through stone, steady, unyielding, and quietly transformative. Every step I took now carried a purpose. My actions had ignited conversations behind closed doors, about equity, recognition, and the silent power of resilience. Colleagues who once hesitated to voice their ideas now approached me with tentative confidence. I realized, perhaps for the first time, the depth of influence a single determined voice could wield. I spent time mentoring my team, not just in strategy or technical skills, but in navigating corporate politics with integrity, resilience, and strategic empathy. I shared the nuances I had learned, how to assert presence without arrogance, how to use observation as leverage, how to transform frustration into actionable strategy. Empowerment, I discovered, is not given, it is cultivated and shared. At the same time, I couldn't ignore the cultural undertones of our workplace. Being a Black woman in executive leadership was not just a role, it was a statement of representation. A subtle rebellion against centuries of invisible ceilings. Every meeting I led, every decision I made, echoed beyond our office walls, into the community, into networks that had long waited for figures like me to claim visible, undeniable authority. One afternoon, Malik tried to reclaim control. He scheduled a meeting with the intention to undermine my authority, to assert dominance with charm and assumed influence. I knew it would come. I had anticipated it, and I welcomed it. The room was tense when I entered. Malik already seated with that familiar, overconfident grin. But this time, I was prepared in every sense. I had notes, reports, and evidence ready, not just about performance metrics, but about leadership impact, mentorship outcomes, and community engagement initiatives I had spearheaded. Malik, I said, voice measured, confident, I appreciate you taking the time to meet. I understand there have been concerns about team direction and project outcomes. Let's review the facts and work toward clarity. He tried to interject, charm in full force, but I guided the discussion with precision. Every statistic, every anecdote, every decision he had misrepresented or minimized, I countered, not with aggression, but with clarity and authority. The subtle power of evidence and preparation made my rebuttals sharp and undeniable. By the end of the hour, the dynamic had shifted entirely. Malik's confidence faltered. Denise watched silently, perhaps learning a lesson in humility and respect. My team, observing from outside the glass walls, saw not just their leader in action, but a blueprint for resilience, strategy, and empowerment. But corporate revenge isn't about humiliating others. It's about transforming adversity into strategic advantage and growth. I made a conscious choice not to exploit personal vulnerabilities, not to humiliate colleagues publicly. My revenge was in the undeniable demonstration of competence, integrity, and leadership, a mirror held up to those who doubted, revealing both truth and consequence. In the following months, I continued to champion equity within our office. Initiatives that had been overlooked were finally implemented. Projects that had stalled found direction. Mentorship programs were formalized to ensure that no voice would go unheard. The culture of subtle exclusion began to erode, replaced by a cautious but genuine respect for diverse talent and perspective. I found myself reflecting often on the interconnectedness of community and professional life. Our office, much like our broader neighborhoods, thrives on recognition, inclusion, and empowerment. Success is never solely individual. It is a network of shared victories. Mentorship and mutual respect. My personal journey had become a vessel for change beyond my immediate sphere, influencing corporate norms and inspiring colleagues to recognize their own potential. Yet, there was a personal transformation I hadn't anticipated. I realized that revenge, in its truest form, was never about others. It was about reclaiming my own narrative. For too long, I had allowed microaggressions, biases, and office politics to dictate the perception of my value. By strategically reclaiming authority and demonstrating resilience, I had rewritten my story, not for recognition, but for self-respect, empowerment, and authentic leadership. Walking out of the office late one evening, the city skyline shimmering through the glass walls, I felt a quiet satisfaction. Not triumphalism, not vengeance in the petty sense, but clarity, power, and a profound sense of justice. The world had seen me. My team had seen me. And I had seen myself, capable, strategic, resilient, and unapologetically empowered. From that moment on, every decision I made was guided by strategic empathy, integrity, and empowerment. I led with confidence, mentored with intent, and advocated with precision. I understood that true corporate revenge is the art of elevating yourself and your team through adversity, not tearing others down. And perhaps most importantly, I realized that resilience and empowerment create a ripple effect. Colleagues inspired by my journey began their own advocacy, mentorship, and leadership. Small victories compounded into cultural shifts. What had begun as a personal struggle against injustice had grown into a broader movement of awareness, equity, and empowerment, proof that one voice, skillfully wielded, can echo far beyond the walls it first occupied. By the end of the year, the company had changed, subtly but irrevocably. Policies reflected equity, recognition systems were fairer, and the corporate culture embraced the value of authentic leadership. Malik had adapted, learning that charisma alone does not secure influence. Denise had shifted, understanding that control must be tempered with accountability. And I had grown, becoming not just a leader but a symbol of resilience, strategic intelligence, and empowerment for the Black community and for anyone who had ever felt invisible in spaces of power. Jasmine Brown had won, but not through malice, deceit, or spectacle. I had won through vision, strategy, integrity, and an unwavering commitment to justice. And as I looked out over the city one last time that December evening, I whispered to myself, power is earned, justice is claimed, and resilience echoes. If Jasmine's journey inspired you, hit like, share this story with someone who needs it, and subscribe for more stories of resilience, empowerment, and corporate strategy. Drop your thoughts in the comments. How have you turned adversity into power? Your voice matters too.